my name's Molly.
I'm Paul.
And we're really excited today to talk to you about GIS, or Geographic Information Systems. So both of us are GIS officers, and we work for Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust and GISA, which is the record centre. So before we start, I just wondered if we could have a show of hands whether anyone has used GIS before. Cool, we've got 1, 2. Nice, okay. Well, in fact, actually, probably all of you have used GIS in some way or another, even if you don't realise it. So if you've ever used any kind of Google Maps, maybe tracked a delivery or a takeaway or an Uber, or maybe you've looked up a flood zone risk or flood risk in an area that you're looking to move to, then you will have used some form of GIS. So GIS is used across all industries all over the world, but today we're going to focus on nature conservation and environmental restoration. Yes.
Okie dokie, let's kick off then. So let's kind of take a little step back from the technology to begin with. Let's talk about conservation. So conservation, it's about protecting species and habitats. We're trying to restore ecosystems, we're trying to create new habitats, and we're trying to support thriving wildlife populations. But the difficulty that we've got in conservation is that in a really complex natural world, how do we know where to start? How do we know what changes we're going to make? How do we know what to protect and how we're going to protect them? And to do that, we need evidence. Evidence lets us make effective conservation, and evidence requires data. So, data, we can gather it in many different ways. We've got surveying, so that is going to a site. We survey it to see what species are there or what habitats are present. We can census, so we can count the number of those species that are there. And then obviously we can map as well, so we can see exactly where those things are located. That will give us what's known as a baseline, so it gives us a broad picture of what's in a location. But then we can kind of make that better to work out trends by repeating that, and that would be through surveillance or monitoring, depending upon kind of the context. But basically, repeating surveys over the time, it gives us more information and more understanding. So next slide, please, Molly. So by gathering evidence and having the data, we can perform different analysis and we can answer key questions. We can figure out, is a species declining? We can find out what habitat conditions maybe does that species prefer, or we could also find out whether those habitats exist elsewhere within the county. Evidence enables us to take actions in different ways. So we've got direct action, that's habitat restoration, species reintroductions, and land management. So they're physical things that we can do with that evidence, with that data, so that we can improve things for wildlife. We then also have advocacy. So we can influence policymakers, we can influence landowners, we can influence local communities, and we can empower them with data so that they understand the true picture of what's happening for conservation. The data also helps us to develop compelling arguments. So we can use those as a wildlife trust, and we can use those so that we can enact changes that benefit nature within wider society. So next slide, please. So why am I talking about this when it's a talk about GIS? Well, technology. There's lots of new technology that are changing the way that we collect data, we analyse it, and we apply it in conservation. And this talk is about GIS. So that's one of the technologies that we use so that we can figure out what's happening in our county and how we can kind of proceed with protecting wildlife. So next slide. So what we're going to cover today. What is GIS? So we're going to define the term and we're going to explain how it came about, how it evolved. We're going to explain how does GIS work, so what are the tools that we use within the Wildlife Trust, how do we get the data, and how do we use that data. We're going to talk about why and what we use evidence for, and specifically GIS. So it allows us to visualise, it allows us to analyse, it allows us to plan, communicate and collaborate with others. So we'll talk about that. And then after telling you all how great GIS is, we're then going to talk about the limitations and say actually why it can't just be relied on by itself. Next slide, please, Molly. So, caveat. Some of the data that we use today is real data. It's data that we're using to conserve wildlife. Some of it is data that we made up to prove a point so that we can explain things to you. Please don't take any of the visuals that we show today as real life data. There's a mix there. The other thing I wanted to say as well is on some of the slides there are QR codes. If you are interested in the projects that we talk about, scan that QR code and you'll be able to go to the website and find out more about it. So, what is GIS? Let's talk about that. So the definition, and we've talked about that already, it's Geographic Information Systems. It is a tool that combines layers of information so that we can gain a deeper understanding of relationships between species and habitats and spatial patterns within our environment. How do things relate to each other is what we're really interested in, so that we can use that and understand the patterns between those things for conservation purposes. So what is spatial data? Let's talk about that. It's something very simple. It's basically information that has got a location associated with it. That's all spatial data is. Next slide, please. If we think about spreadsheets, which are really useful, we get to keep in those names of species, numbers of species, that kind of thing. But what it doesn't give us is that location. And that's why spatial data is really useful. So these two images here, on one side, that's the spreadsheet aspect of it, the database aspect. And on this side, it's the same information, but it's visualized. So that's really, really useful for us. Next slide, please. So as I've said, GIS, and Molly mentioned it at the start, we probably all used it in some sense. It's maps, it's things like Google Maps, but it is more than that. So we use it in the Trust for data visualization. So that is making complex data easier for us to understand. Various different data sources come in. If we can visualize those in a very simple way, we can make very quick snap decisions about things. Spatial analysis, so it allows us to analyze data that would be really difficult to do in a paper form. The great thing about GIS is, to some extent, it's unlimited, the amount of data that you can have inside it. Pattern identification, so as I've said kind of previously, it helps us to identify trends and patterns so that we can plan for the future. Now, that may be taken into consideration climate change, for example, but it could be other things. It could be maybe where a species is moving and we've noticed that change. And then finally, communication. So when I mentioned before about advocacy and policy, we need to clearly convey our findings to decision makers, stakeholders, and the general public. So it really helps us to do that. So where did it come from? Let's talk about a history of GIS. If you think about paper-based maps, so you think about before we were using computers, imagine if you were trying to plot lots of species on a paper map and you were trying to do that by hand. What happens if those species move? What happens if those habitats change? You need to recreate your maps, and that can be quite a lot of work. With mapping, if you're going into the field, you would be sketching out things with pencils, coloured pencils normally. Again, what if those habitats are overlapping each other? How do you draw that? What are the rules for that? It becomes quite complicated. Then let's think about a paper map, and let's think, okay, so we've got this paper map and we've made it and we're really happy with it. But what if we want a bit more detail in a certain section? Or what if we kind of want to zoom into it? You can't really do that with a paper map. You have to redraw it at a different scale. So there's lots of work that's involved in that. And then finally, I suppose it's worth thinking about field work, so actually collecting the data. When we go into the field, if we're using paper maps, we have quite a rainy climate. So paper gets quite wet and it becomes difficult to work with. So they were some of the difficulties that people encountered when making maps prior to the invention of GIS. So where did it come from specifically? The 1960s. It was developed in Canada and it was to help automate map-based data processing. When it started, It required very, very large computers and very large rooms, and it was very, very expensive, as are most new technologies. We moved through to the 1980s, so it kind of bubbled away in the background, and people were using it and they were developing tools, but it wasn't really mainstream. We get to the 1980s, the home computing boom happens, and suddenly computers are way more accessible for people. The cost lowers, lots of people can have computers. This is the same thing with mobile technology. So obviously mobile phones in the 80s and the early 90s, they start to become more common, and GPS becomes more accessible, so satellite data that you can access via these devices. We get to the 2000s, so the internet has obviously changed all of our lives, changed the world. It's also changed GIS as well. So from the 2000s onwards, we end up getting open source software. So that is essentially free software that is developed for everybody's good. You don't have to pay for it. And we also start to end up with free data sets. So government organisations in the UK, for example, we have got a LiDAR data set which gives us height data. It's absolutely free. So we end up in that situation where we've moved from something that's very expensive and difficult to use, requiring expertise, actually moving down over a very short period of time to suddenly being in a situation where actually everybody can use these kind of tools. Next slide, please, Molly. So how does GIS work? Molly is going to show you how.
Cool. So yes, imagine a high-tech digital map that has lots and lots of layers in it and is essentially linked to a database. So as Paul has mentioned, we can use all of these different layers and these different data sets in our map to start seeing the spatial patterns and relationships between the different data sets to look at trends in our environmental data. So the main types of data that you tend to find in a GIS program will be points, lines and polygons. So these are what we call vector data. Essentially they're 2D shapes. So points might be things like individual trees, lines might be things like rivers or hedgerows, polygons might be things like, so those are areas, so habitats or field parcels, that kind of thing. We then have raster data, and these are essentially continuous grids made up of pixels which contain numeric data. So these are generally used for things like elevation maps, maybe temperature rainfall maps, that kind of thing. And the number of layers that you can have in your GIS is pretty much unlimited. It really depends on your computer power and storage that you have. But yeah, so we're going to go into a kind of example of how you might use GIS. And we're going to imagine that we're looking to find somewhere to put a new visitor centre on one of our reserves. So obviously this is an extremely simplified decision-making process, but this is how we might use GIS to help us to do that. So we might want to consider a few things. So we might want to look at plotting our nature reserves on a map. So we've plotted them as points here, and then we've attached that non-spatial data that Paul mentioned to our points, which is our spatial data, to say whether there is already a cafe there or not. So no cafe is shown in red, cafe is shown in blue. We might want to also consider what the topography is like at these different sites. So we might want to check if it's suitably flat for building a new cafe and visitor centre. So we could use a raster digital elevation model to look at that sort of thing. We might want to check whether the sites are within a flood zone, so we could look at the Environment Agency flood zone data for this. And we might also want to check how accessible the site is. So we could use, for example, OS data to check how far the sites are from the nearest road or urban area. We might, we might also want to check what the habitats are like on the different sites. So we might want to double check that there's no sort of really important or valuable habitats that we would negatively impact by building a new nature reserve. And we could also look at nearby habitat data to double check that we're not going to affect the connectivity of habitats in nearby sites. So all of these things can be combined in a GIS in one place to help us to make an informed, evidence-based decision on where would be the most suitable location for a potential new cafe and visitor centre. So on the board here you can see that the potential sites are highlighted now in yellow. So these are all sites which are within 50 metres of a road, so we're saying that's suitably accessible, are not within the flood zone, are on suitably flat land, and they don't already have a cafe. And we'll say that they're also not going to impact our habitats negatively as well. So we use GIS for visualization and analysis, and in the next few slides we're going to go into some more detail now on how we actually use GIS in our GWT and GSER projects. So visualizing and the visualization of data is really, really important because it makes quite complex environmental data a lot easier to understand, interpret, and communicate, which allows us to make better informed management decisions which are rooted in evidence. So one of the probably best examples of how we use GIS in Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust is as part of our Nature Reserve Condition Monitoring, or NRCM project. So this is a project that's led by Ellen Winter, who some of you might have met or worked with before. And GIS is used at every stage of this project. So we use it right at the beginning to select our sites that we're going to go and survey across our nature reserves. And what we do is we use GIS to create a random sample of sites, and this helps to remove any bias in our site selection. It also means, because we've plotted the sites, the exact quadrat spot that we're going to go and survey, year on year we can return to the exact spot, and then that ensures consistency in our data collection year on year. So Ellen goes out with volunteers and trainees and sometimes some staff members that she can rope along. And they go to all different reserves that we manage. They collect survey data using an app called Survey 123. So this is an app that's developed by Esri, who are a big GIS company. And the app is available to download onto your phone, and anybody can access it. So it makes it really great for citizen science work, because you don't have to have an Esri license to be able to access the survey. So the data is collected. We gather data on all sorts of indicators, so from positive and negative indicator species to percentage bare ground cover, signs of damage by different animals, species richness, soil wetness, and that's just to name a few. And it's all gathered in this one survey, and then crucially we can map exactly where that survey was taken. So we gather all the data, and this is a bit of a snapshot of what the raw data, once it's collected, looks like. So all the data is kind of processed and put into this spreadsheet. And as you can see, it's absolutely vast. There's a lot of data that is collected. And as a land manager, you could absolutely go through this spreadsheet and get any kind of condition data that you need to get about your reserve. But if you had the time to do that, which you probably don't, there's one bit of information that you would be missing from looking at the data in this way, and that is the location. So you wouldn't be able to tell really, or at least not very easily, exactly where on your reserve this data relates to. So we put the data back into GIS and we create these spatial distribution maps, or heat maps. So this is an example of some of the data that was collected last year for Lower Woods. And we've got, so the lighter colours across all the maps indicate a lower number of the indicator that we were looking at, and the darker colour indicates a higher number. So in this top left corner, we've got the number of tree saplings per sample. Top right is the number of woodland ground flora species per sample. At the bottom left, we've got number of native tree species per sample, and bottom right, we've got number of tree seedlings per sample. So what this allows a land manager or anybody who's managing a reserve and trying to assess the condition of the habitats is it allows them to get a really quick view and really informative view of the condition of their reserve and how it relates to every area of the reserve as well. So they can tell which areas of their reserve they need to target their management more effectively to make sure that they're using their resources effectively. Using a similar sort of software. So this time it's another Esri app called ArcGIS Field Maps. We've developed a series of maps and surveys which are all accessible to the land managers on their phones so that they can record their land management activities. So this is actually the desktop version of the app which they can access to, and it basically looks the same as how it looks on their phones. So you're getting a bit of a sneaky peek of their work here. So yeah, they can use the app offline or online, so it doesn't matter if they don't have signal out in the field, and it allows them to collect information in real time, really easily and quickly on their management activities across the reserve. So as you can see, we've got some areas of hay cutting and scrub management, areas of coppicing that they've been doing. And they can overlay this information with other data sets. So we're looking at the pink hash here is some sites of special scientific interest data. The dotty red lines are public footpaths, and we can pretty much put any data set that we want to in this map for them to be able to overlay with their habitat management data. And that really is the beauty of GIS, is the ability to overlay all your data sets together in one place so that you can do the best analysis you possibly can. Our intention then is to overlay our nature reserve condition monitoring data with the habitat management activities data so that we can actually really get going on adaptive management, which is really key to nature conservation and restoration. So GIS is at the heart of adaptive management, and yeah, we're really excited to continue with this work in the future. So another exciting project that we've worked on is the Adder Restoration Project, and this is run by Tom Uridge. And what you can see on the screen here is the data that was collected as part of this project using, again, Survey 123. So Tom, with the help of volunteers, he went out to various sites across the Cotswolds, including some of our nature reserves, and gathered data on adder mat locations and also adder sightings. So some of the points denote adder sightings, some of them denote an adder mat, and then what he would do is record, or the volunteers record, presence or absence at that adder mat. So not all of these points are necessarily presence of an adder, but you could access that extra information if you were to click on any of those points. So what this is really exciting for, and what GIS could help us to do, is if we were to repeat this sort of project in the future and collect the data in the same sort of way using GIS, we'd be able to answer questions like how does the adder population distribution change over time? We could look at what kind of habitats do the adders seem to prefer, because we could overlay our habitat data. We could look at things like, do the adders tend to be affected by potential disturbances such as footpaths and roads and other human sort of activities. And we could also overlay this data, which is what we've done here, with our land management activities to see whether our management activities are having an impact on the adder population. So the sort of white and black hashed little blobs or polygons are Tom's habitat management activities. So he's been doing some scrub control and fence installation, some woodland edge creation, and some woodland glade and ride creation. So we'd be able to really start to analyse our data to make sure that our efforts for conservation are kind of effective. So we also use GIS for planning. So it really helps us to understand and target our conservation efforts. So on the screen here, this is a snapshot of a project that we've been working in the Record Centre on with Natural England. So this project is looking at updating the Ancient Woodland Inventory GIS dataset. It's actually a national project, so counties across England are taking part, but we're focusing on Gloucestershire. So this project really heavily relies on GIS. Without GIS, it literally would not be possible, because the work that it involves is basically categorising every single parcel of land across all of Gloucestershire to say whether it is woodland or wood pasture and parkland or neither of those things, in both the epoch maps, which is historic mapping about 100 years old. So that's this black and white kind of hand-drawn map that you can see on the screen, and comparing it to modern day satellite imagery. So just so you can get your bearings a little bit, these fields in the top corner here, thanks Paul, are the same as those fields in the modern satellite imagery. You can see that boundary is really unchanged. Over on the right hand side, those fields there, thank you Paul, are those fields there, and these fields down the bottom are those fields down the bottom. And what you can see is that so these little drawings, I don't know if you can quite make out, depict woodland in the historic map. That whole area in the centre that was once woodland is now a big quarry. So what GIS allows us to do is track habitat change over time. And what it also means is that we can do it from the desktop. We don't need to go out necessarily and survey in person every single parcel of land in Gloucestershire in order to track that habitat change. That would literally be impossible. It would take an age. So, do you have a question? Yeah.
Sorry, just
That's
very
okay.
quickly.
Yeah.
As part of the programme, do you then eliminate farmland from your survey, or is there a link with farming communities to gather information?
Oh, no, so we don't involve landowners or that kind of thing in this project specifically. It's purely desk-based, and any agricultural land isn't included, or it's coded as not woodland, unless it appears to be wood pasture and parkland, in which case we would include it as wood pasture and parkland, because that might indicate potential ancient woodland status. But yeah, it's pretty much purely desk-based, this study.
Okay. And do you at any stage take into consideration the impact of farming practices on species?
Yeah, definitely. That is considered in lots of projects that we do across the Trust, actually. So we have Tim and Emma, our farm advisor officers, and they work really closely with farmers across the county to map their land for, map habitats across their land. And they also sometimes, as part of different projects, will provide them with suggestions for opportunities for environmental enhancement on their land. So being able to do this in person would take an absolute age, and also because of the fact that this project is desk-based, it doesn't involve getting landowner permission, that kind of thing. We're not worrying about having to kind of contact landowners to get permission to go and survey private land. So GIS is really central to this project, and the importance of having an updated ancient woodland inventory is that by identifying areas of potential ancient woodland, we can ensure that they get the necessary level of protection from development and protect those really important habitats. Sort of subject in terms of tracking habitat change. our really super clever citizen science officer, Mike Kings, has been working on processing Ellen's nature reserve condition monitoring data that we saw a few slides ago, and creating these kind of predicted changes in habitat for Ashelworth and Coombe Hill nature reserves. So on the board here, this is his results for Coombe Hill. And what this shows is, so the top diagram is data from a couple of years ago, and the bottom diagram is data from more recently collected data. And what they show is that there has been a significant decrease in the grassland indicator richness across the habitat, and a significant increase in the fen indicator richness. So the yellow and green colours are the grassland indicator richness, and the darker green indicates higher richness, and then the purples and blues are the fen indicator richness, with the darker purples representing a higher richness. So moving from the top to the bottom, you can see that the bottom diagram has a lot less of the darker green, so that shows that the grassland indicator richness is decreasing, and there's a lot more of the darker purple colours, so that's showing that the fen indicator richness is increasing. So what this tells us is that our habitat is becoming wetter on this reserve. It's moving towards a more fen-like habitat. And this really isn't that surprising, considering the last couple of years have been very wet and we've had prolonged spring flooding. But what's really exciting about this sort of modelling and mapping that Mike has been doing is that in planning terms we might be able to use it, because it's a model, we might be able to use it to start predicting how our habitats will change in the future. We can look at things like projected climate data and plug this in as well to start making sure that we're preparing for environmental change and building resilience across our reserves. So in another example, we've been using GIS extensively for creating our local nature recovery strategy for Gloucestershire. So you might have heard of the strategy already, but it's a new approach to prioritising nature restoration work and is being undertaken by counties throughout England. So it brings together a range of maps and data sets which are relevant to the development of the local nature recovery strategy in order to help stakeholders and decision makers to plan effectively for nature conservation. By overlaying the different layers in the map, we can see the multiple measures and how they relate to each other in space. So GIS is really enabling us, and actually anyone in the country by the time this draft version goes public, to prioritise nature conservation and restoration in the areas that need it the most. So the mapping hopefully will contribute to reversing the decline in biodiversity and addressing the ecological and climate emergencies. So yeah, just to reiterate, this is a draft version. It hasn't gone public yet. It still needs to go through the full consultation process, but the hope is that the public consultation is going to happen around mid-May, but those dates are yet to be confirmed as well. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled for that, because yeah, it will be up for public consultation. So part of the LNRS mapping is our nature recovery network, and this map on the screen is that. It's our nature recovery network. It's a modelled map, and it combines a whole host of different data sets in GIS, which come from a mixture of satellite imagery, our own habitat data that we've collected, or habitat data that's been collected by other organisations, excuse me, and open source data as well. And we combine all of these layers, run it through a whole heap of processes using GIS to map where our existing priority habitats are, or our core habitats, and be able to assess how connected they are to each other. So the yellowy colours are the sort of existing priority or core habitats. and the pinky colours are where we have opportunities for open habitats. So this would be an opportunity, for example, to create grassland habitat or heathland habitat. The greeny colours are for opportunities for woodland. And then the browny colours are where there's opportunity for both woodland and grassland. So it's not always an either or. It might be that the best habitat that you could create or restore in an area is a mixture of the two. So that could be things like wood pasture and parkland or traditional orchards. We also have a wetland layer, which isn't shown on the screen, but you could overlay that, and that shows opportunities for wetland creation. So it could be things like wet woodlands or fen habitats. So the purpose of this mapping is that it will help decision makers to be really strategic about where to target their conservation efforts in order to plan their effective use of resources for nature conservation. And I think this is my last example, is another really important way that we use GIS is in our record centre for data searches. So Tina is our environmental records officer, and she is responsible for providing all kinds of different stakeholders, researchers, developers and different clients, consultancies with our environmental data, our records for Gloucestershire. So they will have an area of interest, perhaps for potential new development, that kind of thing, and they will want to check that there are no species records of importance within a radius of that area of interest. So Tina processes the data using, we have a really big database that is full of environmental records from all throughout the years. And she pulls that data through into GIS, creates a buffer or a sort of radius around the area of interest, and displays that data on a map so that the client can really easily see if there is anything that they need to make sure they don't disturb or destroy any important records in that area. The database is contributed to by anyone and everyone. We do have a lot of records that come in from environmental consultancies and kind of more, I guess, professional bodies, as well as researchers. But actually, we really welcome wildlife sightings and environmental records from everyone. So on the screen here, there's a QR code that will take you to our Record Centre website, and there's more information there about how you can record a wildlife sighting and submit your data. And actually, the more data that we have, the better our database is and the better information we can provide to different stakeholders and clients in order to protect nature and make sure that nature is really prioritised in the planning process. And the other thing to note is that it's not just interesting or exciting or protected or notable species that we're interested in. If we have data on common species as well, that's also really, really important. And it's generally under-recorded, so we welcome records from all over, and they'll all be verified by experts, so you don't have to be a qualified ecologist to do this. So I'm going to hand back to Paul, who's going to talk about how we use GIS for communication and collaboration.
So Molly obviously just talked through all the different ways that we use GIS to visualise, analyse and plan. But communication and collaboration, let's talk about that. So collaboration to begin with. Obviously we're using GIS internally. We use it to share files with each other, we use it to make maps, we use it to gather data that we've talked about. And as Molly's also said, we also collaborate externally, so that's going to be with other wildlife trusts, or it could be with councils, or it could be with consultancies. Basically, we want to use data and GIS and work with everybody for the benefit of nature. But a really important area of collaboration is citizen science. So citizen science, and Molly just showed that slide, it engages the public to help us with data collection. We can get data on a larger scale using lots of members of the public than we would be able to do just by ourselves. So if you could change the slide, Molly. So a great example of that is the HabiMap project that we've got. So HabiMap is a citizen science project for habitat mapping in Gloucestershire. It brings together citizen scientists and landowners so that we can map and monitor Gloucestershire's wildlife habitats. The aim of the project essentially is to ground truth the remote sense data that we've got. So we want to check if we think somewhere is an area of grassland, we want to go there and check, is that actually grassland and what type of grassland is it? So we can get a lot more detail by getting citizen scientists to help us. To do that, we use software which is called ArcGIS Survey 123, which was mentioned before. This shows you that we can make our own custom forms with it. So we can tailor the information that we want to get from people. We then send those volunteers on site with the app. The app can be on their mobile phone, it can be on a tablet, it can work offline, so they can collect the data and then they can send it to us later. And we send people to the sites between April and September. They collect that habitat data for us by selecting polygons and giving us the information for it. And then we get to September and we go through a process of processing that data. So we take all of that data, we, from that, make reports for the landowners who've let us onto their land so that we can show them these are the habitats that you've got and this is maybe some of the things that you could change. But it is also important for us because we use that data as part of our NRN, our Nature Recovery Network that Molly showed you before. So we're using that data to build an updated map of Gloucestershire, and it's getting ground truth and it's getting changed each time. You change the slide, please, Molly. So another example of collaboration is the 7 Treescapes project. I think with this one, the important thing to know about it is that it's work between 3 different wildlife trusts. So it's 3 counties, it's Gloucestershire, Worcestershire and Herefordshire. And we are aiming to make a 60-mile corridor of enhanced tree cover. And that is to connect 2 of England's largest semi-natural woodlands, which will be from the Lower Wye Valley and the Forest of Dean in the south, and then up to the Wyre Forest in the north. We're using GIS in a couple of different ways on this project. So first of all, we're using GIS to map land holdings as part of the project and also identify designated areas. So that might be SSIs, so that we can actually figure out the right places that we may be able to plant trees. Then we've also got this, which is another ArcGIS project. It's the experience builder that we've used for this. So the idea with this is that we're using this so that we can map the interventions that we've done, we can map land holdings, and this project is shareable between all 3 of the wildlife trusts, so we're all collaborating on this at exactly the same time. If you could change the slide, please, Molly. So another way that we can use GIS, and that was collaboration, we can use it for communication as well. So as I mentioned previously, it's really important that everybody understands the data, and we're not all ecologists. We don't all know kind of how it works. So what we've got here is a great example of that, and this is the garden bird survey that we run each year. It has been running since 1993, and it is looked after by Tina in our Environmental Records Centre. So the idea is with this, we're getting citizen scientists again to be part of our project. We want them to analyse bird population trends, so we'll get them to give us records of where they've seen birds. But also what's interesting for us is that we also get to see where the participants are for the project in Gloucestershire. So it gives us 2 bits of data that we can analyse, and we can actually see whether those things are related. As part of the project, obviously when we get to the end of it for communication, we want to show people what we've done and we want to explain the findings to them. We use another Esri product which is called ArcGIS Story Maps, and this product basically it can integrate maps, it can integrate text, images, videos if we want it to, so that we can really explain our findings to people, and it does it in a very easy way for us. It's a very easy to use tool so we can get the information out there quickly. Our hope obviously is that by people seeing the findings that we encourage participation and that people want to be part of the project in future years. So if you can go to the next slide please. What we need to remember when we are using GIS is that with great power comes great responsibility. We need to make sure that we aren't pushing it too far and that we're actually being sensible and scientific with our findings. So I'm going to hand over to Molly now.
So as with any scientific endeavour, it's really important that we consider the limitations of GIS. So even though it's super amazing and helpful and we love it, there are some considerations that we have to make when we're using it. So these are some of the kind of limitations that we consider most often, but there are other ones as well that we would need to consider too. So firstly, satellite data, which we use a lot in different projects, can be out of date. It's a snapshot from whenever that photo was taken, and so we need to consider, that the habitat might have actually changed since that photo was taken. Also, it can lack detail, so we can't really get down to that species level detail. It might be able to tell us whether an area of land is grassland or woodland or urban, water, but it can't give us that species level detail that we could get from surveys on the ground. And of course we can't see beneath a tree canopy to have a look at what maybe ground flora is like in a woodland. So it doesn't replace the need for in-person habitat surveys, which is why our nature reserve condition monitoring and our HabiMap programs are really important, but it can help to fill in the gaps. Another thing that we have to consider is that the quality of the analysis we can do and the maps we can create will be limited to the quality of the data that we have to begin with. So we just generally have to be mindful of where the data has come from, how old it is, how it was collected, the expertise of the person who collected it, that kind of thing, to make sure that we're presenting it in the most informative way. This leads on to poorly designed maps could lead to misinterpretation. So we always are mindful of how we colour our different layers in the maps, how we overlay them together, what scale we show maps at, to make sure that they're easy to read and understand and interpret, and that we're conveying our message as effectively as we can. Cost is a massive factor, so although we do use some free software, free data sets, and there's a lot of that available now and it's becoming more and more accessible. So for example, QGIS is a platform that we use a lot, and that's a free GIS software. Often software, data sets and data storage solutions can be expensive, and you have to pay for them. So sometimes if we need to, we will pay for things if we can. ArcGIS, for example, is part of so many of our projects and it's really vital to our work, but it is a software that you have to have a license to use, so you have to pay for that. And we just have to be mindful of how we manage our data so that we don't end up running out of storage and having to pay for more unnecessarily. And then the final thing is that GIS, although we are trying our best to make it really accessible and make sure that everyone and anyone is able to map and collect data, it can be really difficult to learn to use, especially the kind of back end of the software. So that can be a bit of a barrier to entry. It can be quite off-putting when people first try and use it, yeah, it's something that we're trying to kind of overcome here and make sure that we use it more and more in the trust. Yeah, so I think that's...
So there you go. That was quite a whistle-stop tour of everything that we do with GIS. Hopefully you'll go away from this and you'll see that GIS is more than just maps. It is about us using data and evidence to make informed decisions for the betterment of conservation and wildlife in Gloucestershire. It helps us to gather, analyse, collaborate, plan and communicate effectively. Without it, it would be a very different situation. It would be very difficult to do all of the things that we can do with the data and the evidence that we have. And as we've said, limitations, GIS is not a standalone solution. We should be careful to use it as a tool along with other things at the same time. It is central to us though, and with new technologies that are changing, so in future projects we are using already things like drone imagery, LiDAR, eDNA sampling. GIS is going to be at the centre of that. It helps us bring all of those data sets together, so it will continue to be central to helping us meaningfully drive action for people and nature. So yes, that's GIS. Thank you very much for coming to our talk.
Thank you. Woo.